Good day. Today is March 2nd. I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. Today, I am going to be joined by Adam Zivo. Adam Zivo is a Canadian freelance journalist who's done a lot of really great work in different publications around Canada on everything from drug policy in Vancouver to the war between Ukraine and Russia on the ground, often actually lives in Ukraine, watching the war firsthand. And he's also done a lot of great work in the Middle East, in particular on the previous Iran and Israel conflicts and Israel-Palestine. In fact, I've actually been on the ground, going around Israel and around the West Bank with Adam before, which is actually where we first met. So I've got a lot of respect for his views on this, even though we don't always see eye to eye on it. His views are sober, and I think they're come by honestly. So I want to welcome to the program Adam Zivo.
Thanks for having me.
Adam, you are no longer in a bomb shelter. That looks a little nice for a bomb shelter, but you're coming to us from Tel Aviv right now, right?
I am, and the atmosphere here is much more orderly and much calmer than those in the West would assume.
I mean, I guess people there grow up with it. They're used to it. It's not their first rodeo. But you know, we've all been seeing footage of the. They're not nuclear tip. Whenever we talk about ballistic missiles, everyone assumes it's nuclear, but these are not. They're conventional ballistic missiles, but they've been pounding at Tel Aviv where you are. We've all seen some fantastic footage with the interceptor missiles, the Iron Dome, hitting these, but it's not hitting all of them. Well, what's the mood like there right now, and what's it just like at nighttime watching these incoming missile attacks and the interceptor attacks?
So the atmosphere on the ground here is very orderly. There's not a lot of chaos, and no one's watching interceptors hitting missiles in the sky because they're in the bomb shelters seeking cover and not looking. Sorry, let's do that one more time. Sorry, I'm a little bit thrown off by like having this on. Okay, let's.
Okay.
So you asked what's it like, watching these. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I want to clarify that no one is watching interceptors strike ballistic missiles in the sky, because if there is a ballistic missile on its way to Tel Aviv, then you are already in the shelter. So you are not outside looking at all of this. The atmosphere in Tel Aviv, in most parts of Israel right now, is relatively calm and that things are orderly. And I'm going to give you some context to build up to this. So first of all, Israelis have existed in a state of conflict for decades. They're surrounded by neighbors who don't like the fact that they're there and want to ethnically cleanse them. Now, since 2023, we've had a more active state of war with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, and now with Iran. And that has created an escalating level of violence and threat. So when you had Hamas and Hezbollah sending in missiles, these were usually smaller munitions that, could kill you if it landed nearby, but for the most part, didn't do too much damage. And so you could just go to your stairwell and you would probably be fine. Or you could stay inside your reinforced room in your apartment, which is known as a mamad. Then when Iran came in, that changed everything because these ballistic missiles can do a lot of damage. So just down the street from where I am, for example, there's an impact site. I was actually only 800 meters away when that hit back in June.
That was from the 12 days war. That was the site that you sent me to while we were there.
Yeah, so that's the 12-day war. That shattered all the glass in 200 meters. That collapsed or half collapsed several buildings, destroyed basically all of the cladding of a nearby skyscraper. And those buildings are still in ruin. And so in this situation, people go to the main shelters. So since the 1990s, every single building built in Israel needs to have a reinforced shelter in the basement. This is all, reinforced concrete. You have basically a submarine door that's airtight. And these things are borderline impregnable. And then, of course, you have the public shelters that are scattered all throughout every city. And it's illegal to deny anyone access to any shelter, even if it's in a private residence. So all of this stuff is very easy to access. I know 4 or 5 different shelters within 5 minutes walking distance from where I am, including unofficial shelters that are not sanctioned to, absorb these hits, but are still protected. So people went down to that. Then there was also a system in place in the Iran war. So you would get a notification on your phone. It's an emergency notification. It is basically the equivalent of an Amber Alert, and it makes the same sound, like the is jarring. It gets your attention. It's effective, and it tells you that you need to go near a safe place, near a shelter, because you're going to get a follow-up alert soon. Usually that means in 5 to 10 minutes. So you walk near the shelter. There's so many nearby. It's not hard. It's pretty calm. And then you get the follow-up alert, which is sent to you via an app. You hear all the air raid sirens. And in Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds to get into a shelter. If you're, for example, getting a missile and you're in the south, maybe that's 30 seconds. If you're in the north, maybe that's 10 seconds. But in Tel Aviv, it's 90 seconds. You go inside, you wait 10, 15 minutes so that the missile is intercepted and any of the debris falls down and doesn't kill you. And then you go outside. And that is the process. And you just repeat that again and again and again and again. And that's what people did during the Iran war. And most people were fine. And the people who did die were people who were not in the shelter for the most part. And when I was interviewing people at the time about whether they felt scared, they kind of shrugged and they said, look, it's not great to say, but why weren't they in the shelter? Why weren't they following protocol? So with this new round of the Iran war, everyone knew what to expect. This was nothing new for them. They had been at war with Iran before. They trusted in the IDF to protect them. So when we received our message at 8:15 in the morning, we walked to the shelter. Everyone was totally calm. They were checking their phones. They didn't, they expected this. We all heard for weeks before that something was going to happen. And then the first alarm just said Israel attacked, Iran. And people realized, well, Israel attacked Iran, but we don't know if there doesn't seem to be a retaliation yet. So we don't need to be here. So after 2 or 3 minutes, they all left. And then I was walking throughout the city afterwards, and it was fairly empty. Many people were leaving for the north and south because Iran predominantly targets Tel Aviv and Haifa in the center. So people were going to rural areas that are less likely to be targeted by ballistic missile. Some people were buying provisions, not a huge amounts because everyone was already prepared. And then we started to get more and more and more alerts. And so by 4 p.m., I think we got 7. I think across the day, we maybe had 10, 11, 12. They all bleed into each other. So you go in the shelter, out the shelter, in the shelter, out the shelter. The Iranians were really committed to ensuring that Israelis got their cardio done and got their steps in. And yeah.
So, okay. So I guess you haven't seen it. I know the temptation's got to be there to, watch it once. But it might be like looking at a solar eclipse. It's interesting to watch, but probably a bad idea.
Look, I'm going to say I'm a curious person. I also like being alive.
Yep. No, you definitely made the smart decision. But the Iron Dome is, world famous for how effective it is. It's extremely effective against smaller munitions from, some, Hamas guy, firing a little thing over the fence. It's extremely effective against that stuff. It's less effective, though, against the ballistic missiles, however. How many have gotten through to Tel Aviv while you've been there?
It's hard to tell for sure because there's a sensor in place. So there are things you can't always report on or that you're not aware of because, there's an operational security element to it. If a missile lands by an area that's militarily sensitive, people aren't supposed to talk about it. So I don't know. But I know of at least 2 hits that have happened. There was a hit that was near my neighborhood, like 1.5 kilometers away, destroyed a few buildings. I think killed 1 person and injured a few. There were some in the south. But the vast majority of these missiles are intercepted. And that is great. That is why people are outside jogging and sitting at cafes because they know that the Iron Dome works. Now, I do want to clarify that if one of these missiles lands directly on your building, directly on your shelter, you are going to die. That is pretty much understood. But people say, well, you know what? The chance of that happening, statistically speaking,
Very small. Yeah.
Very small. You may as well be, you will probably be hit by a car instead. Right. Now, one thing that I have noticed over the past few days is that the number of alarms, the sense of danger that we're seeing right now is actually less intense than what we saw with the 12-day war. So during the 12-Day War, they launched a lot of missiles. They hoped to saturate the environments and use up the Iron Dome and get a few missiles through. This time, they don't seem to be doing this as much. There are fewer missiles heading towards Tel Aviv. And the reason for that is that the Iranians seem to have calculated that they can get the United States to stop this war if pressure is applied on the Arabian Gulf states. So right now, Iran is bombing Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE.
Well,
because
everywhere where
Israel,
they've got military, where there's U.S. military bases in these Gulf states, right?
yeah, but not just the U.S. military bases. They're bombing residential areas. They're bombing
Yeah,
hotels.
they're sorry,
Right.
they're hitting countries that host U.S. military bases. They're not only hitting the military bases, but countries that host U.S. military bases.
Well, I mean, like it seems as if their campaign is somewhat indiscriminate, right? And it seems like they're also attacking the economies of these countries. So, for example, I think they attacked, maybe it was Qatar's, like one of them, they attacked like their main oil refineries, right? And so the idea here is that these Arab Gulf states are allied with the United States. I mean, they're not always the easiest of allies. But at the same time, they do economically cooperate, and the United States relies on them for their energy. And they're both aligned in their dislike of Iran. And so the Iranians have calculated, okay, well, if we attack Dubai, if we attack Doha, cities that are not set up for defense in the same way that Tel Aviv is, cities that are softer targets, then maybe we can get these states to run to Washington and say, please stop. We are suffering too much.
Yeah, well, they've also been able
so
to create enough chaos with the Strait of Hormuz to get essentially everybody to stop moving their tankers through. So that's, I mean, if there's I don't mean to make light of a terrible situation, but if there's a silver lining for Alberta, it's our budget deficit maybe gets a little smaller for the year with the price of oil, but Strait of Hormuz is not seeing a lot of tanker traffic at the moment, and that's going to badly hurt the Gulf states at this moment. So that'll probably bring some pressure to bear on the United States.
And then that creates some political pressure on Trump because energy prices are rising. So that's the calculation. And it seems like, and this is why we're not getting, that many attacks here. This is why things are relatively relaxed. But they really miscalculated because they didn't scare these Arab states. They pissed them off. And now it's very clear that there's going to be an enhanced alliance between these states and Israel and the United States to combat Iran. And there's a context for this. So we have to keep in mind that many of these states, they are monarchies. And they really
they're Sunni. They're Sunni, and they really don't get along well with the Shia. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like Catholics and Protestants, but
Old
back when that
school
was
Catholics
more
and
important.
Protestants back in the day, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's mutual distrust in terms of religious sectarianism. And then also these monarchies are worried that the fundamentalism, the radicalism of the Islamic regime will destabilize their countries and lead to revolution, right? And so this is why quietly you've seen rapprochement between these states and Israel. This was epitomized by the Abraham Accords, which normalized relationships between Israel and several Arab states. And in fact, Saudi Arabia and Israel were on the cusp of normalizing their relationship and establishing some diplomatic relationship in 2023, late 2023, early 2024. And it's hypothesized that this is why Iran essentially got Hamas to commit October 7th to derail that process, which turned out to be successful. Now, the underlying problem with this trend is that there was a gap between elite opinion and public opinion, right? So the elites wanted to work with Israel. They were afraid of destabilization, but they were constrained in what they could do because their constituents, not voters, because these aren't democracies, but constituents really, really do not like Israel. And even if you're not a democracy, it is destabilizing if your constituents really resent what you're doing. And so I believe that this new evolution could actually dramatically change the trajectory of the Middle East, because not only are these Gulf elites now really cemented in their conviction that Iran needs to be taken care of, or like the Islamic regime needs to be taken care of, I would imagine, this is my hypothesis, I don't have evidence yet, but I think it's a fair assumption that many of the everyday constituents / citizens of these states may rethink their relationship to Israel if they see Israelis helping to protect their skies and protect their glistening skyscrapers.
Maybe. It could go that way. It could go the other way as well, though, where they say we're only getting attacked because we're in league with America and in league with Israel. It could go either way. So let's talk about the causes of this war. The casus belli. There's been, it's really similar to Iraq in that it's kind of two put forward. One is that we just need regime change. We're kind of back in the war of America exporting freedom. We're going to give you McDonald's and strip clubs and nice big banks. That's one. Oh, and democracy, of course. Yeah, I'm sure that's what it's always about. Regime change. We'll talk about that in a moment. But also nuclear weapons. Now, if true, that would be, more plausibly in the United States, is in America's interest to want to prevent further proliferation of nuclear armed states in the world. But we haven't, the Secretary of War gave no evidence of this. Donald Trump gave no evidence of this. Marco Rubio gave no evidence of this. They barely even tried making the case for evidence that Iran was on the verge of having a nuclear weapon in the 12-day war. But Netanyahu has been declaring for 30 years that Iran is mere weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. The 12 days war, the United States claimed that they had degraded the nuclear potential capabilities of Iran by years, possibly decades. So I find that very difficult to square with now. If the United States' proclamations of the 12-day war are correct, then it seems to me to invalidate this war so soon after, if they have degraded their capabilities between years and decades. No one seems to be talking about that. But Israel has been beating this drum, and Netanyahu in particular, for 30 years. I want to just play, I did this with another conversation I had today on the topic. I want to play a little clip here from Benjamin Netanyahu, kind of best of talking about Iran's nuclear program through the years.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months.
They have the wherewithal, the stored up, preserved knowledge to make a bomb very quickly if they wanted to do it.
Iran is so dangerous. Weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
They're very close. They're 6 months away from being about 90% of having the rich uranium for an atom bomb. Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so, the Iranian regime are crazy. Like they are, they're crazy ayatollahs, and they've got a particularly radical and apocalyptic theocratic ideology. You got the hidden 13th Imam and all this stuff we won't get into. It's all, it's pretty kooky stuff, but pretty broadly bought into by the regime, and at a minimum, a very large portion of Iranian society. But Netanyahu has been, maybe he's not crying wolf this time, as the story goes of the boy who cried wolf, but he's clearly been crying wolf for 30 years. We just had the 12 days war, where America expended no blood of its own, at least, but at least a lot of its treasure and military capabilities to finish that war for Israel. And the White House issued a statement afterwards saying, there's some people are saying that we didn't decimate their nuclear program. This is fake news. We got them. It's done. Those two things, that cannot be true, and this be true at the same time. Two-part question for you. How do you buy the imminent nuclear threat put forward by Netanyahu right now? And Israelis you're talking to, they, as you and I both know, they'll say, it's not a monolithic culture. They have their own opinions. They don't always agree with the government. Israelis you're talking to, are they buying it? I know Israelis are broadly hostile to Iran, and Iranians are hostile with Israel, and most Israelis probably want the Iranian regime gone. But are most Israelis you speak to, are they buying the excuse of imminent nuclear weapons?
Before we go into this, I just want to make a clarification. So most Israelis actually love the Iranian people, and Iranians are they mostly love Israelis. And that's something that I really appreciate.
I think regimes. The regimes. Yeah.
The regimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm agnostic on the potential imminence of the nuclear threat for Iran. I don't know that area with much depth, so I don't want to comment on it. But do I think that Netanyahu might have been overselling the threat in years past? Probably.
For 30 years past.
Yes. But we also have to keep in mind that part of the reason why Iran has not been able to develop nuclear weapons is because its adversaries have tried to thwart that program. So, for example, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, you had Stuxnet, which was the most sophisticated cyber worm ever developed at that time. And that sabotaged the nuclear program gradually and did a lot of damage there in terms of slowing down the development of nuclear weapons. Then we had the JCPOA. So that was the comprehensive agreements where Iran would receive sanctions relief in exchange for giving up its nuclear program for a certain period of time. And so they slowed down their nuclear program, but they continued to enrich their material far beyond the purity level needed to just use it for energy. And that raised a lot of eyebrows and suggests to many people that the ultimate goal for this was to resume nuclear weapon development once the clauses in this agreement eventually expired, because there was a sunset clause, right? So from my understanding, from the experts who I talk to, they all say that, yeah, there's a nuclear threat and we're getting closer to it. And it seems like it's pretty imminent. We don't know exactly when it could be, but it's something that they are nearing towards. Regarding the 12-day war, I think the Trump administration is overselling the success of that operation. And it's very much in Trump's style to claim a complete victory when it seems like he didn't actually end up doing much. And many Israelis who I spoke with, both average Israelis and experts in security, have said that they were actually disappointed by the American intervention because they felt like it was kind of performative. The Americans came in, did a little bit of bombing, didn't actually destroy a lot of nuclear material, left, claimed victory so that they could seem powerful, while the Iranians actually didn't have much of their capacity destroyed, right? And then many people who I spoke to in Israel said, look, we expect there to be another war with Iran soon because we didn't finish the job in the 12-day war. Trump says we did. Obviously, we didn't. And it's going to blow up again. And that's exactly what happened. It's also important for us to understand that nuclear weapons, that is one part of a larger arsenal of weapons aimed at Israel. So Iran has also been working on a ballistic missile program. So they have thousands of these ballistic missiles, and just one of them can do an insane amount of damage. As mentioned before, just one of them landed down the street from where I am, and the damage that it left is insane, right? And when they have, I think, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 thousands of them, they can saturate the air, they can overcome the Iron Dome, and they can destroy large parts of Tel Aviv. And that's what most people were actually expecting earlier.
Yes, but those missiles were launched as a retaliatory strike, though, for being attacked by Israel. I mean, this doesn't make Iran a choir boy here, but they've been used as a deterrent to, maybe make Israel think twice about it. They're also, they're not they're hitting the Gulf states, as you said. That's sort of a counterattack, but those countries did not attack Iran. They're hostile with Iran. There's a long-standing kind of Cold War going on in the Middle East between Iran and the Sunni Gulf states. But those ballistic missiles have been retaliatory. Not to whitewash how they're using it. They're going after civilian targets. They're just hitting anything they can.
No, I mean, I'm going to have to push back on this. They clearly want to use these missiles to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Iran
no, but
has made it.
They did not start launching them until Israel and the United States attacked them, though.
Okay, so Derek, let's say you had a baseball bat and you were wrapping it with razor wire, and you clearly said that you wanted to kill me. And I saw that you weren't finished wrapping this baseball bat, so I grabbed my own baseball bat and hit you before you can attack me. And you say, actually, this was my defensive baseball bat. I don't think that would fly. And I see a similar dynamic here. Look, Iran has been waging war against Israel for several years, for a very long time, using its proxy program. Once the nuclear program was kind of sidelined by the JCPOA, Iran pivoted to adding more funding to its proxies, to putting more money into Hamas and Hezbollah. And that turned out to be fairly effective, right? And we saw with October 7th, the amount of damage that could be done. But while many Israelis did suffer on October 7th, it could have been much, much, much worse. So Israelis generally perceived Hezbollah in southern Lebanon as being the main threats. And Hamas in Gaza was the little guy. We'll take care of them later. We will deal with Hezbollah first and maybe Iran first, and then we'll clean up with Gaza. Iran's plan was to essentially launch an attack with Hezbollah, with Hamas at the same time, and to shower ballistic missiles across Tel Aviv so that all three of these factors combined would cause the collapse of the Israeli state. Had Hezbollah attacked the same day as October 7th, the results would have been catastrophic. Northern Israel would have been occupied. You could have seen hostile forces in Tel Aviv, but there was a disconnect, right? So Hamas launched their attack without consulting Hezbollah. The reason why is a bit unclear. Some speculate that they wanted to hog all the glory because they were the junior partner here. And then Hezbollah was not prepared. And by the time they were prepared, the northern military had been mobilized.
Well, they also don't particularly like each other. Again, they're both radical. For over here in the West, we kind of think, it's radical Islamists. But, one's radical Shia Islam and one's radical Sunni Islam. And they don't particularly like each other, which is probably good for Israel that they don't particularly get along. Okay, but let's talk about the other casus belli here, which is regime change. This is a wild departure for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in the last years of Obama, before he even announced he was going to run for the Republican presidential nomination, said no more regime change wars, no more fighting other people's wars, no more Team America World Police. We are going to, he's not a pacifist or even an isolationist, but this was going to be America first. America is going to fight wars that are in America's interests and in America's interest only. And that precludes regime change wars unless it's clearly in America's interest. Something like Venezuela, you can argue if it was prudent or not. It was certainly impressive at a minimum, but it was America's backyard with a hostile regime right on the other side of the Gulf. So, okay, maybe there, maybe. But regime change in Iran, that's not a clear American interest. And they've said that, this is, Secretary of War said, no boots on the ground. This is not like Iraq, no boots on the ground. It's going to be decapitation strikes against senior political and military leadership. We're going to degrade their naval and air defense capabilities. We're going to work on the army. And then when this is all done, the Iranian people should rise up, seize the government for themselves, and bring about regime change. So the absolute best case scenario would be then some kind of color revolution, and it's relatively bloodless, and we get some kind of liberal democratic regime in Iran. I think the chances of that happening so neatly are extremely small. I very much hope I'm wrong. I will apologize to you, all our viewers, and the world. And I really want to apologize. That would be a fantastic outcome, and I'll admit I'm wrong. But I really don't think I'm going to be. I think one of two things is likely to happen, the two likely scenarios. One, it'll be like Gulf War I, where the regime gets hit. Some groups get incited, like the Kurds in Iraq. And remember, we got Kurds in Iran too, quite a few. These groups rise up. And what did Saddam do to the Kurds? He gassed them. He massacred them, and you're going to see more brutal repression from the Ayatollahs, from the Islamic regime, and they're going to hold on to power. The Ayatollah Khomeini is gone, great, but there's 100 more lining up to take the job. These guys are not afraid to die. So the likely scenario, one of the likely scenarios, is the regime just brutally cracks down and a bunch of people die and the status quo more or less remains. Or second, we do potentially get regime change, but through a protracted and bloody civil war, kind of like Syria. Okay, the West is going to provide some air support and weaken the regime. We'll sanction the regime. The regime collapses and fragments into different sides. In Syria, we just ended up getting ISIS in a suit, essentially. Who know? I make no prediction of who would emerge victorious in a big civil war in Iran, but Iran is many times the size and population and geography as Syria, which is a relatively small, relatively inconsequential country compared to Iran. That seems to be the more likely outcome. And then who knows who emerges victorious at the end? There's no guarantee that in a civil war, the good guys emerge. Remember, there was pretty much no, who were the good guys in Syria? Everyone was it was like a 5-sided civil war. None of it made sense. This just seems to be a recipe for a big mess. And it seems to be a wild departure from America First foreign policy that Trump ran for president 3 times on.
Well, so, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you brought up here. I'm going to break it down into different segments.
You can pick what you want. I did want a bit of a rant.
Yeah. So I'm going to first of all just start before I go anywhere else, just to make the moral case for this intervention before we go into the strategic case, right? So let's not forget that this is a regime that is bathed in blood, right? It is a regime that brutally oppresses and kills any political dissidents. You know, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the first thing the Ayatollahs did was murder thousands of political dissidents and torture them and rape them and imprison them. And
but everybody in the region's a gangster. Like, we got the Saudis that we're allied with. They're all gangsters. They're all crazy and murderous.
I mean, I'm sorry, but the Iranian regime is of a different nature, right? And this is where, you know, you've had these pro-democracy movements that have happened every once in a while. They bubble up, and then they are suppressed with rivers of blood, right? So back in Iran in 2019 and in 2022, and then just recently, you know, 2 months ago, we had millions of Iranians marching in the street demanding democracy, and the regime killed approximately 30,000 of them in just a few days. From my understanding, this is the first time that a government has killed so many of its own people in such a short period of time in peacetime, right? This is like 10
but we think for a second
squares.
that if the Saudi people rose up demanding democracy, they don't tend to rise up in the same way. You know, different people, I guess, different reasons. But if the Saudis rose up, do we not think for a second that the Saudi royal family and the Wahhabists would not brutally slaughter them too? And we're allied with those people?
I think that we understand that the Saudis, you know, have their own problems. But as of now, the reality is that we do not see a huge tension between the Saudi people and their monarchy, right? So if there's a future where that changes, then I might change my opinion. But we're dealing with the world as it is. And with the world as it is, you do not see that same tension in Saudi Arabia. What I will say is that Iran is not like Iraq or Syria. Iraq and Syria are recent fabrications from the colonial era. These are countries that are highly artificial, that group together different ethnic groups and religious groups that have very little to do with each other, which is why they've been so dysfunctional. Essentially, some Europeans drew some lines on the map and said, this is the country now. And all the people were like, well, I guess we're part of the same country, but we don't really have a national identity. We have our own tribal identities, our own ethnic identities, and we're going to keep on fighting.
Well, the Iranians have their own major minorities too. They're more homogeneous than, say, Iraq and Syria. I agree. That's correct. But they have a very large Kurdish minority, very large Azerbaijani minority, and a not huge but sizable Arab minority as well. And these guys are not particularly happy. They're not they're not necessarily speaking. They're not speaking the same languages, Fahan or whatever. They're not ethnic Persians or Iranians, the way the majority are. They have their own big minorities too.
They do, but for the most part, this ethnic separatism is not a big issue in Iran right now, right? The country's about 20% Azerbaijani. I'm not sure what the Kurdish percentage is. It's not all Persians. It's not as ethnically as modern as some people believe, but there's a much firmer sense of national identity than what you would see in Iraq.
It's true.
And we also have to keep in mind that Iran, has millennia of civilization behind it, right? This is not some new country that was invented 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. This is a civilization that has been around for millennia, that has a long history of basically operating as a single state in this region. So the idea of it falling apart into warring states would be a big historical anomaly. They have a long tradition of operating as a single geographic unit.
Ideological. There's a sizable, I'm not going to chance what the proportions are, but there's a very large westernized, fairly liberal, pro-democratic part of Iranian society. Most of the Iranians or Persians that we meet in Canada or in the United States, they tend to be of that, self-selecting, they tend to be of that variety. But what proportion? I don't know if it's a majority or just a large plurality, but there's a bunch of crazy revolutionary Shia Islamists as well. So, it'll be along ideological and religious lines as well. It might not be as ethnic as, say, the Kurds versus the Sunnis versus the Shia in versus kind of Western-backed forces in Iraq, but it'll take on different dimensions. If Iran falls into civil war. I think it's unlikely that it falls into a nice, peaceful color revolution.
No. I mean, obviously there's going to be some tension, but I think that the degree of this tension and the risk of tension is a bit overblown. And yeah, of course, there are some radical, hyper-conservative, hyper-fundamentalist elements to Iranian society. The mullahs, have some base of support, but every Iranian who I've spoken with, every single one of them, they all emphasize that Iran as a country is not really that deeply Islamic, right? And there's a historical reason for this as well.
Ones over here. The ones here, like, I've never met an Iranian I didn't like over here because they're self-selecting. The ones that are here are great. I like these ones. But there's some ones over there who are a little less noble.
No, I mean, they don't say that everyone is secular-minded. They'll, of course, acknowledge that Islam is a part of this, but they say that, Islam is a part of Iranian society, but it is not nearly as important as it is in other countries. And there's a historical element, right? So for Arabs, they might see, Islam as being a big part of their ethnic identity. Islam came from the Arabian Peninsula. But for Persians, they often view Islam as something that was imposed upon them historically, right? They existed as a civilization long before this. They were Zoroastrians. They view themselves as having civilized the first Islamic empire. And they always kind of maintained a certain degree of secularism, and they looked down upon the Arabs, and they looked down upon radical Islam, which they associated with the Arabs, right? And then now, many Iranians, not all, but many, view this radical Islamism as a foreign imposition on Persian culture, right? And they think that the Islamic regime is trying to erase Persian culture by replacing Persian identity with a pan-Islamic identity. But on the whole, it seems like everything points to this reality that Iranians, for the most part, not all of them, are relatively moderates. They're well-educated. They're sophisticated. You have a lot of human capital there that you wouldn't have, for example, in Afghanistan. Like, the average Iranian is going to be much better educated and much more, I guess, even cosmopolitan than the average, Afghan sheep herder, right? And that creates fertile ground for successful governance. And then on top of that, you have an Iranian diaspora, which is very well educated and often fairly affluent, and they are yearning to help rebuild a new Iran because many of them left because of the Islamic Revolution. And this diaspora is a huge asset for stabilizing a post-revolutionary Iran in a way that you wouldn't see with Iraq or Afghanistan.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue to where I want to go now, is that if we have something that does fall into civil war, again, if this is not a nice, peaceful, or relatively peaceful color revolution, the regime's weekend, millions of people, go surround government buildings, demand regime change, and they get it. Great. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope I apologize for my predictions here. But I think much more likely is it's going to be an armed conflict of some kind of civil war. That would generate a lot of refugees. We've got, when we had Syria, Syria is a much, much smaller country, and we had millions of refugees flowing into the West, into Europe, into North America, particularly Europe. It's a conflict right now. The Germans said on paper, Merkel said, "Oh, it's temporary." I don't know how, nobody really believed that. They're now telling the Syrians, you got to go home. The civil war's over. It's safe. Most of them are refusing. It's been vetoed by the minority coalition partner, the Social Democrats. So they're probably staying. The West has its own huge migrant crisis right now and can't absorb this. But if Iran falls into deep and destructive civil war, it is so much bigger than Iran. The number of refugees could dwarf, so much bigger than Syria. The number of refugees from Iran would dwarf what we saw from the Syrian refugee crisis. So, how is it? I don't think it would be in the interests of America. It's not very America first. It's not in the interests of Canada and Western Europe to have all of these refugees flowing into them. And in particular, you're on the ground in Israel. I want to know if you maybe agree with me on this point. My inkling is that Israel, who has been, and Netanyahu in particular, who's been itching for this war for 30 years, Israel's not going to accept a single one of these refugees. These refugees are going to be our problem. Canada, maybe not the United States, because maybe Trump will not, maybe he won't let them in, but Canada's going to get hit with them, and Western Europe is going to get hit with them. And I don't think Israel is likely to accept a single refugee.
I mean, fundamentally, you're opposing support for regime change because you're taking the worst possible scenario and treating it as if it's sort of like a preordained outcome, right?
Oh, it's a plausible scenario, though. I'm not sure it's the most likely. I think the worst case scenario is just like the Iranian regime cracks down and gasses everyone. The way Saddam Hussein did with the Kurds after the first Gulf War.
Look, I personally don't think that this idea of there being some massive refugee crisis is too likely, because if this regime change fails, then you're just going to have, another military junta coming in and taking control of everything and then clamping down on the protesters, right? I think this idea of there being this Syria-like conflict, quagmire, is pretty implausible. But we can agree to disagree on this.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
What I will say is that there's a tendency amongst millennials like ourselves to assume that every Middle Eastern conflict is going to look like Iraq or is going to look like Afghanistan. And
they've all turned out poorly. They've all turned out poorly. We got in Syria, we got ISIS in a suit. We fought and bled for 20 years in Afghanistan. The Taliban's back in charge. Iraq is shattered. Iraq is essentially 3 countries at this point. On paper, it's 1, but none of these have turned out well for us. So
because we're looking at states that were deeply artificial and dysfunctional to begin with and had no historical tradition of operating as a single unified, stable state, right? I mean, Afghanistan was a series of tribes before. So, and we try to force them to be democratic and to function as one state. No, that doesn't make sense. Persia is different. Persia is an ancient and, singular civilization. But in terms of America first, look, Iran is an essential part of this authoritarian bloc that wants to undermine American interests in every way possible. Its allies, Russia, North Korea, China, they are all working together closely as friends. And I think that sometimes in the West, we fail to fully appreciate that. We are divided, they are united, and that puts us at a disadvantage. And so I think it's myopic to view Iran as just, an enemy by itself. We have to think of it as a key member of this larger anti-Western alliance. And so I think that the United States has a clear interest in knocking out one of the most anti-American powers in the world, right? The Iraq, like the mullahs always say, the United States is the big Satan, the big Satan, the big Satan, and Israel is little Satan. So once they get rid of Israel, from their perspective, they can move on to getting rid of the big Satan, the United States. So these are not our friends. These are not, these are enemies who are itching to try to attack the United States. So getting rid of them, good idea. Let's kick our enemies' ass. Why now? Well, Iran is in the middle of an economic crisis. Its main bank basically failed. And so to deal with that, the Iranian regime printed a whole bunch of money, which, as we all know, never works, Luckily for us, Trudeau printed some money, but not enough to cause hyperinflation. There, it was much worse. So now their currency is basically worthless. Their other banks are on the cusp of collapsing as well. And so we know there are economic problems. There's a water crisis. We have mass unrest. We had millions of Iranians protesting against the regime in January and February. And now 30,000 of them were slaughtered. And that shows that the regime is fragile. And that shows that there is, this reservoir of support for change. So this is the perfect time to strike, right? There is no reason for us to wait until Iran stabilizes and continues to build up its ballistic missile stockpile. It is prudent for us to attack now.
Okay. We're running out of time, but just the American public is not backing this right now. When you and I are pretty similar age, we remember the full court press of propaganda around going to war with Iraq. They at least went through a bit more of a dog and pony show. We remember Colin Powell at the UN with his PowerPoint presentation or whatever, big blown up pictures. They at least made the case that they had nuclear weapons of mass destruction. A reasonable person could have given the government the benefit of the doubt at the time, and a majority of Americans did, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and it was therefore an American national security interest, a vital national security interest to do this. They didn't do it with the 12-day war. They didn't do it this time. The Americans don't have a stomach for regime change wars right now. The Democrats are mostly against this. The Republicans are now very split. The harder kind of America First, maybe original MAGA wing is pretty hard against this. It's maybe the softer, you see Lindsey Graham, more establishment Republicans, they're loving this. They're very supportive. But the American people are not there for this right now. And I know foreign policy cannot be conducted by polling. Leaders are elected to make tough decisions, often unpopular decisions. But this goes completely in the Trump said no war with Iran. All three elections, this was his thing. No war with Iran, no more foreign adventures, no nation building was the term. And this is very clearly nation building and interventionism in the region. This seems to be, to me, is really just kind of the Israeli wish list. This is what the Israelis want. They want regime change. They want Iran defanged. And I understand why the Israelis want that. That's what they want. But the American people do not want this. And collapse for Israel, support for Israel is collapsing. It's collapsed already on the left, and it is very quickly collapsing on the right in America and across the West as well. I'd put it to you that this is just kind of Netanyahu cashing in his chips for America to do one more big war for them, because that's why it's happening now, because I don't think America is going to be doing this in the future. The support for their wars has collapsed.
I mean, I'm sorry, but one thing we know about Trump is that he does what he wants to do, and I don't think this is Netanyahu.
He always said he doesn't want to do this.
The United States,
but he said he doesn't want to do this. 3 election cycles. He's erratic.
He's erratic. He went and he took out Maduro just like this, partially because Rubio said that Maduro is big in drugs, right? So like,
I'm not denying he's erratic. I'm not going to argue on those grounds. But he's been consistent on this. This is one of the things he's been consistent on. He's not changing his views on Iran like he would change wives or something here. He's been very consistent on this. He's always opposed it. The mega base opposed it. This made him. This is one of the big things that made him president 2 out of the 3 times. And he's just
things changed.
switched.
Look, things changed. He set a red line in the sand. He said, Iran, if you kill these protesters, I will do something. And he set that line. Maybe he did it impulsively. And then that line was crossed. And Trump is an egotistic man. He's a proud man. And he is the kind of man who made fun of Obama for setting red lines in the sand in Syria and not following through. So I think for Trump...
He also said he was going to invade Greenland. I mean, the guy says a lot of... You have to take Trump seriously, but not literally. So, I mean, how does anyone know where Trump red line is? He said he was going to take Greenland by military force if necessary.
Well, he suggested it kind of like it could be an idea in the future, but he was pretty unequivocal in saying, look, this is my red line and I'm going to offer help. And I think he painted himself into a corner here. But at the same time, I think that there is this unique opportunity to get rid of this regime, and that can change people's calculations. You can be against an action, and then you can say, well, the situation has changed. I didn't know that there were going to be millions of people protesting. I didn't know there was going to be an economic crisis. I didn't know that my enemy was going to be so weak, and I'm going to take advantage of it. Now, I don't think that this is Netanyahu orchestrating things. I think that there's a tendency to imagine that, like, you know, the Israelis control everything in the United States, which is ridiculous. We know that there are many Republicans, many foreign policy hawks who have never liked Iran and view it as its threats, justifiably so. And this is a natural extension of that long-established American foreign policy tradition. Now, regarding the fact that this is unpopular, look, I'm going to put my cards out here. I respect politicians who do the right thing, even if it's unpopular. I deeply respect, for example, Margaret Thatcher. She pushed for reform even when she didn't fully have buy-in from the voters, and she changed the United Kingdom, you know, dramatically for it. And, you know, the Falkland Islands, for example, is a great example of this. So what I see here is an administration that sees an opportunity to do something that would bolster American security interests, that is also morally the correct thing to do, that could be an enormous win. And Trump is taking a gamble, because I think that should this be successful, should the regime fall, then this would be one of the most revolutionary changes in the Middle East in a generation. And he could go down in history as the guy who got rid of the Islamic regime, and the political dividends of that would be insane. So I think on some level, the Trump administration feels confident enough that they can achieve their goals, that they are willing to take this gamble and put a lot of political capital on the line. And so we'll see if that gamble plays out. I'm not a fan of Trump. I really dislike many of the things that he's done, including on the Ukraine front. But for the sake of the Iranian people, I wish him the best here.
Well, I wish him the best, and I hope you're right. Maybe I'm just too bloody cynical at this point. I hope I'm wrong. That this ends. That this has a happy ending, because I like to cheer for America. I like, you know, traditionally the good guys. I like to cheer for America. I'm still cheering for American forces in this. You know, I want them to succeed. I just don't think they should be doing it. But I really appreciate your time. We should definitely. This is very quickly evolving. There's going to be a lot more about this. I hope you get to say "I told you so" to me. That's what I hope.
I hope so too. My closing message is this: if you have a regime that calls you the Great Satan, that has spent decades trying to undermine you, and you see that they are weak, you should kick their ass and help put in a new government that is more amenable to your interests. That is the right thing to do in terms of your security, and is the right thing to do for the people in this country.
All right. Well, Adam Zivo, independent freelance journalist and globetrotter on the ground in Tel Aviv. Greatly appreciate your time and your insights.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you.